Cultural sensitizing is the perspective of cultural and religious equality outside one's own. Also known as multiculturalism, it is a respect for cultures that belong to people who have immigrated outside their region. Similarly used by folks who study anthropology, it is a method that lacks judgment and focuses more on the safety and well-being of people. I was curious about law enforcement's cultural diversity training within the United States and United Kingdom that work to handle situations involving people of other countries with language barriers but also cultural misunderstandings. Because cultures and religions are different from person to person, for safety officers it is important to have cultural knowledge in order to better grasp non-traditional domestic situations and to provide the best effort to create safety. I will go into 3 examples of where cultural and religion have faced a body of authority or law enforcement to explain how their approach has either supported or failed outside cultures. According to Stephen M. Hennessy et al., the interest in placing a culturally diverse police training started in the 1960s. At the time, the civil rights movement was rising in the South. If you run an internet search for the time period, you will find cultural evidence of insensitive reactions towards protesters and images of police enacting their power through physical violence. Police officers would then receive regular trainings reflecting the past experiences of people of different ethnic groups, races, and lifestyles, in an effort to assert safety, cultural understanding, and unbiased behavior by officers composed largely of non-minorities. The majority of these trainings were held by officials of ethnic or racial minorities and presented minority issues in the form of panel presentations in order to create understanding. Similar to trainings regarding domestic violence situations, officers must understand the foundation of incidents in order to successfully protect those receiving harm. I will now go into the first case in which law enforcement faces a need for cultural sensitizing for civilian aid. I mentioned a little about cultures transcending into foreign territory. In the 1980s, South Asian women organizations, or SAWO, were rising out into the open to provide cultural hubs in the United States and United Kingdom. While white feminism was occurring at the same time, the SAWOs were also questioning the intimate partner violence occurring once thought to be a personal problem. Immigrant men and women were allowed to legally work and reside in the United States through a green card permit by the Immigration and Naturalization Services. Because most immigrant women were dependent on their husbands' permits to remain in the country, they would often refrain from reporting any violence to police. Most immigrant women feared reaching out to police in the event of violence, afraid that they would be deported. As a community service, the SAWOs would provide a safe space for discourse of marital abuse and violence against women to come out in the open and receive resources, allowing this personal problem to become a public issue. Although SAWO's community services were a great resource, they continue to organize and seek solutions to other prevalent issues. Along with domestic violence awareness in the South Asian communities, they also organized to address immigrant women's rights. Among these needs were legislative regard to protect women in violent situations and create a focus of their safety instead of setting a bias or stereotypical understanding from law enforcement and judges. For example, Margaret Abraham conducted interviews with women reaching out to SAWO and learned about the lack of understanding from police officers because of language barriers causing the inability to explain what happened. Instead, officers would look for visible bruises or marks. Upon finding nothing, they would make no arrests, leaving the woman with her attacker. Even the use of South Asian men as interpreters in court provides the male perspective and bias of the cultural dynamic of marriage. Our next sensitivity case took place in a U.S. military prison camp located in Cuba. In 2013, the media picked up news regarding internal feeding, or feeding detainees through the nose and into the stomach with the use of tubes while strapped to a chair. According to the lawyers of detainees in Guantanamo Bay, a hunger strike was in effect caused by the lack of comfort items, including the Quran. This controversial method of feeding is a response backed by the U.S. federal regulations to ensure the health ethics of the camp. But outrage struck as it was reported, again by lawyers, that the prison would continue to use enteral feeding on Muslim detainees during the month of Ramadan, a period of observance of Islam where fasting occurs during the day hours and after sunset breaking the fast. Although folks representing the detention camp, including Judge Collier, insist that they are responsible to keep detainees from starving, it is also admitted that it is a form of the preservation of order, security, and discipline. Others view this as punishment for the hunger strike. Cultural awareness, along with petitions and outreach, helped in the interference of enteral feeding. Yet this only changed the schedule of meals to before dusk and after sunset. What led me to this project was a want to be involved in getting the correct training out to police officers and anyone of power who is in charge of the safety and well-being of others, but potentially are ill-equipped to handle a situation due to cultural, language, or religious barriers. About 4 years ago, I watched Banaz, A Love Story. The film's plot goes that a family residing in a Kurdish community in the UK is plotting gender violence on their daughter, who is seeking divorce after her experience of marital abuse. But according to her family's cultural and religious beliefs, one who brings shame to the family must be erased, as to not pollute the rest and even emasculate the men if nothing is done. Although only a small minority of the Kurdish community continues this ritual. A number of cases of honor-based crimes in the UK were brought to court. According to Rupa Reddy, there have been attempts to plead not guilty to a murder charge and instead tried to plead guilty to manslaughter by reason of provocation. In other words, they claim that any reasonable man would have acted the same upon the situation. The court would test the defendant's level of self-control and whether the gravity of provocation is reasonable. The UK courts say that testable notions of provocation could also include taunts to the defendant. In the case that there is a plea of manslaughter with reason and provocation, the court will want to see if the defense is reasonable, but neglect cultural evidence of gender violence. Some early cases of honor-based crimes saw the success of defendants, as some judges even reduced jail sentences on the basis that something went off in their head. In the case of Banaz Mahmoud's murder, her cousins were brought to justice and received life sentences, as well as her father and uncle who planned her death. Unfortunately, for the officers she frequented were not trained to respond to the now obvious threats that she faced. Cultural sensitizing not only brings forth attention to occurring violence, but can also create plans to prevent the preconceived interferences of this outdated shaming, gender violence, or organized crime. Through awareness and updated trainings, Banaz would have remained alive.